What happens when one of Hollywood's most iconic screen legends steps onto a daytime talk show set where the hosts believe they're in complete control of the conversation? At first, it looks like another ordinary celebrity interview, but within minutes, everything takes a turn no one in the studio expects. And what unfolded next wasn't just uncomfortable. It became the kind of television moment people would be talking about long after the cameras stopped rolling. Clint Eastwood, a man whose quiet confidence has intimidated villains for generations without ever needing to raise his voice, arrived expecting to promote his latest film. Instead, he found himself caught in a tense exchange with Joy Behar that transformed a routine appearance into an unforgettable clash of personalities. Before we get into what happened, make sure you subscribe and leave your thoughts in the comments, because this story only becomes more surprising as it unfolds. As the broadcast went live, Whoopi Goldberg greeted him with a warm smile and introduced him to an enthusiastic audience. Thunderous applause filled the studio while Eastwood acknowledged everyone with a polite nod before taking his seat, resting his hands calmly on the chair as though nothing could disturb his composure. "Thank you for having me," he said in the deep, unmistakable voice audiences have recognized for decades. Keeping the atmosphere relaxed, Whoopi asked about his newest project and what inspired him to tell this particular story. Eastwood paused for a moment before explaining that the film centered on the idea of redemption. Sometimes, he said, people deserve another opportunity even after the world has already decided who they are. Sarah Haynes leaned in with genuine curiosity, complimenting the message before asking how he still chooses meaningful stories after such an extraordinary career. Eastwood's answer was as simple as it was powerful. He said he searches for honesty, stories that reveal something authentic about people, because, in his view, Hollywood already has more than enough fantasy. For several minutes, the interview flowed effortlessly as he spoke about directing, working with actors, and the lessons he had learned over decades in the industry. The audience listened intently, completely absorbed by his experience and calm wisdom. But one person remained unusually quiet. Joy Behar sat back with a faint smile that suggested she had been waiting for exactly the right moment to interrupt. Then, without warning, she leaned forward. "Clint, can I ask you something?" she said, her tone noticeably sharper than before. She questioned how his comments about truth and redemption aligned with his past support for certain political figures, implying there was a contradiction between his words and his actions. In an instant, the relaxed atmosphere vanished. It felt as though the temperature inside the studio had suddenly dropped. Whoopi glanced toward Joy, silently hoping to steer things back on course. But the conversation had already crossed a line. Eastwood slowly turned toward Joy, his expression tightening ever so slightly. "Which comments are you referring to?" he asked evenly. Joy responded with a smile that seemed more calculated than friendly, bringing up his political endorsements and suggesting they reflected support for individuals who had made controversial remarks about women and minorities. Without showing the slightest hint of agitation, Eastwood calmly replied that he had never made statements attacking women or minorities. Joy immediately pressed harder, arguing that even association with certain politicians carried a message. Around the table, the other hosts exchanged uneasy looks, as it became increasingly obvious this interview was moving somewhere none of them had anticipated. Eastwood leaned back, fixing Joy with the same unwavering stare that had unsettled countless movie villains over the years. He reminded her that he had spent decades working alongside people from every imaginable background and political belief, judging individuals by their character rather than the party they supported. Joy instantly bristled at being addressed as young lady, insisting she had every right to ask difficult questions. Eastwood answered just as calmly, saying he also had every right to refuse questions designed to manufacture controversy instead of encouraging genuine conversation. His voice never rose, yet every word landed with unmistakable force. Joy's expression hardened as she defended herself, insisting she was simply asking about his public record and calling it journalism. Eastwood let out a quiet chuckle before replying that journalism, at least as he remembered it, relied on facts and research instead of fishing for sensational moments. Sensing the growing tension, Whoopi tried to guide the discussion back toward the film, but Joy refused to let the issue go. She argued that public figures should expect difficult questions after making controversial political statements. Eastwood remained perfectly composed, though there was a sharper edge in his eyes now. Joy brought up his famous empty chair performance at a political convention years earlier, suggesting it had seemed unhinged. Eastwood answered without hesitation, explaining that it had simply been a creative metaphor about political accountability and asking what exactly she believed was so outrageous about it. Joy continued pushing the point while the studio audience sat in complete silence. Even members of the production crew appeared frozen, sensing they were witnessing something far beyond an ordinary celebrity interview. Then Eastwood leaned forward, just slightly, lowering his voice until everyone had to listen even more carefully. He asked Joy a simple question. How many films had she made? She fired back that it had nothing to do with the discussion. Eastwood calmly repeated the question, asking how many films she had directed, produced, or starred in. Joy insisted she was a television host and comedian, not a filmmaker. Eastwood nodded before asking another question. How many Academy Awards had she won? Growing visibly frustrated, Joy argued that the question was irrelevant. But Eastwood wasn't finished. He asked how many careers she had helped launch, how many aspiring actors she had given their first opportunity, and how many stories she had created that truly changed people's lives. Joy replied that she entertained audiences every day through the show. Eastwood looked at her with genuine curiosity, before quietly asking if that was really what she believed. Because from his perspective, it seemed more like she invited guests only to provoke confrontations that generated ratings and viral clips. Sarah Haynes quickly tried to ease the tension by praising Eastwood's films and asking what had brought him the greatest satisfaction throughout his remarkable career. Eastwood smiled politely at Sarah before answering that the most rewarding part had always been working with true professionals, people who understood that respect is earned instead of demanded, and who never relied on cheap attacks against their guests from the safety of a panel. Joy stared at him in disbelief, repeating the phrase, cheap attacks, as if she couldn't believe what she had heard. She insisted once again that she was simply asking legitimate questions about his political views. Eastwood calmly corrected her, saying there was a clear difference between having an honest conversation and deliberately trying to manufacture a viral moment for social media. Joy immediately rejected the accusation, insisting she was only doing her job. But what happened next would take the confrontation to an entirely different level. That's your job, isn't it? Eastwood replied without raising his voice. You're here to find out why your guests came. I came to talk about a film I care deeply about, a story about redemption, forgiveness, and people earning a second chance. Instead, you seem determined to turn this into a political spectacle. Sensing the tension growing, Whoopi stepped in once again, trying to redirect the conversation. She smiled toward Eastwood and asked him to tell the audience more about the film's main character. Eastwood answered, though his eyes never left Joy. He explained that the story followed a man who had made serious mistakes, but refused to let those mistakes define the rest of his life. Sometimes, he said, the hardest obstacle isn't your past. It's the people who refuse to let you move beyond it. The message landed heavily across the studio, and everyone understood exactly what he was implying. Joy certainly did, and the irritation on her face became impossible to hide. Sarah Haynes quickly praised the film's powerful message, hoping to pull the interview back on course by talking about redemption as one of storytelling's greatest themes. But before the conversation could recover, Joy interrupted again. She questioned whether some people deserved redemption at all, suggesting that anyone who repeatedly supported divisive politics eventually lost the right to another chance. Eastwood's jaw tightened ever so slightly. He calmly asked whether she was referring to the character in his movie or whether she was trying to drag the discussion back into personal politics. Joy insisted she was talking about accountability and claimed that public figures owed that responsibility to their audiences. Eastwood looked at her for a long moment before asking a question of his own. If public figures had responsibilities, what responsibility did television hosts have toward the people they invited onto their stage? Joy answered instantly that they were obligated to ask difficult questions. Eastwood shook his head. In his view, their first responsibility was something much simpler: treating guests with basic respect and human decency. He quietly added that somewhere along the way, she seemed to have forgotten that. The other hosts exchanged increasingly nervous glances. Behind the scenes, Whoopi was already trying to signal the producers, but Joy appeared convinced she was winning the exchange. She laughed dismissively before accusing Eastwood of spending decades glorifying violence through the tough characters he portrayed on screen. Audible gasps echoed through the audience. Even by the standards of heated daytime television, the conversation had crossed into dangerous territory. Eastwood leaned back and studied Joy silently for several seconds, almost as though he were seeing her clearly for the very first time. Then he spoke. He told her the real problem wasn't the questions she asked. It was that she believed volume made her correct and confrontation made her courageous. In reality, he said, it only made her look like someone who bullied people from behind the safety of a microphone. Joy's eyes widened in disbelief. Her voice shot upward as she demanded to know if he had really just called her a bully. Eastwood never flinched. He said she spent day after day taking shots at guests who were placed at an unfair disadvantage because they were expected to remain polite while sitting on her program. She might mistake that for strength, he said, but from where he was sitting, it looked remarkably small. Joy shot to her feet, furious. She reminded everyone that she had interviewed presidents, world leaders, and countless celebrities throughout her career. Eastwood calmly responded by asking how many of those people had walked away feeling respected, and how many believed they had experienced a fair and professional conversation. Joy struggled to answer, insisting she didn't have to tolerate his accusations. Eastwood nodded and agreed that she didn't. Just as she had every right to reject his criticism, he had every right to refuse being turned into another prop for political theater, when all he had wanted was to discuss his work. Finally, Whoopi stepped in more forcefully, suggesting everyone take a moment before things escalated even further. Eastwood slowly rose from his chair and calmly told her there was no need. As far as he was concerned, he and Joy now understood each other perfectly. Joy, visibly shaking with anger, insisted he couldn't simply walk out because he disliked the questions. Eastwood answered with the unmistakable confidence that had defined his screen career for decades. He said he had come out of respect for the show and to speak about something meaningful, not to become someone's target for the afternoon. Joy protested that the program was broadcasting live and that leaving would make him look unable to handle difficult questions. Eastwood calmly reached for his microphone and explained that true strength wasn't trapping someone in front of a television audience. Real strength was recognizing when a conversation had stopped being honest and deciding it was time to leave. Desperate to regain control, Joy warned that viewers would think he was running away. Eastwood paused, looked directly into the main camera, and addressed everyone watching at home. He explained that he had arrived hoping to discuss a film with an important message, but instead found himself in a conversation driven more by the pursuit of viral moments than genuine dialogue. If that reflected the direction television was heading, he suggested, audiences could judge it for themselves. Turning back to Joy one last time, he quietly added that he had been answering difficult questions long before she ever sat behind a microphone. The difference, he said, was that those questions had usually come from professionals. Joy's composure finally broke. She angrily called him an arrogant has-been who thought he could insult her on her own show. The words echoed across a studio that had fallen completely silent. The other hosts sat frozen, and even members of the production crew looked stunned. Eastwood slowly turned back toward her, wearing the same calm, unreadable expression audiences had seen in countless classic westerns. He repeated the phrase, has been, almost thoughtfully before replying that it was an interesting criticism coming from someone whose greatest achievement, in his opinion, was spending her career discussing everyone else's accomplishments. The silence that followed was almost overwhelming. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Eastwood repeated the words once more, reflecting on the irony that throughout his long career he had been criticized many times, but usually by people who had built remarkable accomplishments of their own. Joy insisted she had achieved plenty herself, though the certainty in her voice had begun to disappear. Eastwood answered quietly, asking her to consider what those achievements really were. Had she become known for meaningful conversations, or for insulting guests, fueling controversy, and turning interviews into spectacles? Joy defended herself by saying she simply asked the questions that needed to be asked. But even she could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice. Eastwood calmly corrected her one final time, saying the difference was simple. She wasn't asking the questions people needed answered. She was asking the ones that attracted the most attention. And what happened after that would leave the entire studio stunned. Eastwood looked at Joy without the slightest sign of frustration. He said there was a clear line between real journalism and putting on a performance for attention, and somewhere along the way that line had disappeared. Realizing the interview was slipping completely out of control, Whoopi made one last effort to save it. She suggested everyone reset the conversation, encouraged Joy to apologize if necessary, and proposed returning to the film that had brought Eastwood there in the first place. Joy immediately turned toward her in disbelief. Apologize? For what? For doing her job? Before Whoopi could respond, Eastwood calmly stepped in. He reminded Joy that her job was supposed to inform and entertain viewers, not to treat invited guests like targets for public confrontation. Joy insisted she had never attacked him. Eastwood let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. He said he knew exactly what a real attack looked like, because he had experienced one in real life. At least, he added, the people who confronted him back then did it openly instead of hiding behind a television format designed to corner their guests. Around the table, the atmosphere had become painfully uncomfortable. Sarah Haynes looked as though she wished she could disappear, while the other hosts stared silently at Joy with expressions that ranged from disbelief to embarrassment. Even the audience shifted uneasily, sensing they were watching something far bigger than an ordinary interview. Trying to regain control, Joy challenged him, saying this was her house, her show, and her rules. If he didn't like the questions, he was free to leave. Eastwood smiled, but the smile carried none of the warmth from earlier in the interview. He agreed that it was her house, and then quietly explained why that was exactly the problem. Rising to his feet, he said that in her house, guests were ambushed instead of welcomed. In her house, disagreement was treated like disrespect, and creating conflict had become more important than creating understanding. If that was the environment she had built, he said, then she could be proud of it. But it wasn't one he intended to stay in. Joy fired back, insisting he had no right to lecture her about television. Eastwood calmly corrected her. He wasn't lecturing her about television at all. In his opinion, what had happened there barely resembled television anymore. He said it looked more like a circus, and she had appointed herself the star attraction. Audible gasps spread through the audience. Nobody expected the exchange to reach this level. Joy completely lost her composure, demanding to know how he dared insult her on her own program. Eastwood glanced around at the rest of the panel before quietly observing that he had always believed it was supposed to be a discussion shared among several hosts. Instead, he remarked, it seemed to revolve around one person while everyone else simply watched from the sidelines. That was finally enough for Whoopi. She firmly told both of them that the confrontation had gone far enough and urged Joy to calm down. But Joy was no longer listening. She accused Eastwood of arriving with an air of superiority and disrespecting her before a national audience. Eastwood answered just as quietly as before. From the moment he sat down, he said, she had seemed more interested in provoking a confrontation than having an honest conversation, and that, in his view, was where the real disrespect had begun. Joy repeated that she had only been doing her job, but the confidence behind those words had almost completely disappeared. Eastwood slowly shook his head. If she had truly been doing her job, he explained, she would have asked about the film, the creative process, or the experiences that shaped his work. She could have given viewers insight into filmmaking or a meaningful discussion worth remembering. Instead, he gestured toward the cameras surrounding them and said the last 20 minutes had been spent trying to embarrass a guest who had arrived in good faith. In the end, he added, the only people who had been embarrassed were the show and the person trying to create the spectacle. Joy searched the room for support, but none came. The other hosts avoided making eye contact. The audience had clearly shifted in Eastwood's favor, and even members of the production crew appeared uncomfortable. Finally, Joy argued that if he refused to answer serious questions, perhaps he shouldn't be accepting interviews at all. Eastwood had already begun removing his microphone, but those words made him stop. He looked directly into the main camera and explained what he believed a real question actually sounded like. A real interviewer, he said, might ask what continued to inspire him after so many decades, what advice he would offer young filmmakers, or which story meant the most to him personally. Questions like those existed because someone genuinely wanted to hear the answer. Turning back toward Joy, he quietly added that meaningful conversations required curiosity, and he no longer believed that had ever been the goal. The studio had become so silent that every movement behind the cameras seemed unusually loud. Joy opened her mouth as though preparing another response, but for perhaps the first time all afternoon, no words came out. Eastwood continued in a calmer voice than ever before. The greatest disappointment, he said, was that everyone in the room had been given an opportunity to have a thoughtful conversation about decades of filmmaking, storytelling, and experience. Instead, that opportunity had been traded for manufactured conflict and the pursuit of attention. Carefully placing his microphone on the table, he said that wasn't only a waste of his own time, it was unfair to the audience, who deserved something far more meaningful than another performance built around outrage. Joy finally found her voice again, insisting nobody had the right to tell her what her viewers deserved after she had spent decades connecting with them. Eastwood straightened his jacket and quietly asked whether she had truly connected with people or whether she had simply spent years making the loudest noise in the room. Those, he said, were two very different things. Behind the cameras, producers frantically signaled to one another, clearly unsure how to handle the situation unfolding live on air. Their biggest guest was preparing to walk away after completely taking control of the interview. In one final attempt to regain authority, Joy called for security. Eastwood actually laughed. The first genuine laugh anyone had heard from him all afternoon. Security? He asked. What exactly were they supposed to do? Remove him for bruising someone's ego. He slowly looked around the studio one final time, taking in the stunned faces surrounding him. After more than 60 years in the entertainment industry, he said he had worked alongside extraordinary directors, legendary actors, and some of the finest professionals imaginable. Yet despite all of those experiences, he had never encountered anyone quite like Joy. She sarcastically asked whether that was meant as a compliment. Eastwood replied that she could interpret it however she wished. Then he offered one final observation. By tomorrow, people wouldn't remember the interview because of hard-hitting questions or journalistic integrity. They would remember it because one person had completely lost control of the conversation on live television. With that, Clint Eastwood calmly walked toward the studio exit, leaving behind a silent panel, a stunned audience, and a host still trying to process how the interview had slipped so completely out of her hands. As the doors closed behind him, the cameras caught Joy sitting speechless while the rest of the panel remained frozen, fully aware they had just witnessed a television moment that no one in the studio had expected. What began as a simple promotional interview had transformed into an unforgettable confrontation that would dominate conversations long after the broadcast ended. Whether viewers saw it as a clash of personalities or a lesson in composure under pressure, one thing was undeniable. Clint Eastwood had once again demonstrated that his greatest weapon had never been force, but quiet confidence. Now it's your turn to weigh in. Do you think Joy Behar finally met someone she couldn't intimidate, or do you believe she was simply doing her job? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable stories like this one.